Danielle will gratefully sign them for us, that is extremely relatable. And she has digested so much science and research, extensive information, and made it very relatable to the non-science person. So I can't read you the long list of her awards. It's just, it would go on and we don't have enough time. But I will say that she holds a PhD in psychology from Indiana University with postdoctoral fellowship in genetics. She's the founding director of the Center for Research on Behavioral and Emotional Health at VCU. And she is currently she's the inaugural director of the Rutgers Addiction Research Center at the Rutgers Brain Health Institute, where she is a professor and does the majority of your research. Visit the dogs, but hopefully they want to visit us too. I have no DNA shared with my grandchildren. I have 6 grandchildren. They're my stepdaughter's children's, and they're wonderful. But I'm looking to Danielle to help decipher all the things, how to make it the most productive and enjoyable 3 days with Grandma and Grandpa without any parents to intercede for all parties involved. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Danielle.
That's a pretty tall order, but let's see what we can do here. Thank you so much, Alicia, for that kind introduction, and to the panel for inviting me to be here today. It's an especially special day because it is my mother-in-law Susan's 70th birthday. I've got my parents here, lots of the rest of my family, a college roommate. So, I mean, Kilmarnock, you can really bring it here. So, you all know a little bit about me, but I want to start by knowing a little bit more about you all. So, by show of hands, how many folks here are parents? Okay, most everyone. How many are grandparents? Okay, most of this crowd as well. How many of you, when interacting with the children in your life, have found that they do not always behave like the lovely, polite little individuals you're hoping them to be? They do things like roll their eyes, not wear the cute outfits you purchased for them, refuse to eat the thing they just asked for 5 minutes ago. In fact, this is one of the things that I think is most fascinating about studying and understanding children. That we have literally been raising tiny human beings for hundreds of thousands of years. And we have done amazing things over the course of history. We've put a man on the moon. We've developed devices where you can talk to someone on the other side of the world, where you have all the information you might need at your fingertips. And yet, it can still feel so hard to get the kids in our lives to behave the way that we want them to all the time. It's not for lack of information. There are a million parenting books and parenting blogs and parenting magazines, and you can hardly pick up a newspaper without reading about tiger moms or helicopter parents or snowplow parents or free-range parenting. We're a culture that's literally obsessed with how to raise children. In fact, never before has there ever been so much time, attention, and research that's placed on how to shape our children. And so I think that with all this background, with this time we're investing in it, with all the information we have, why can it still feel so hard to get children to behave in the ways that we want? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book is because when I became a parent and I started paying attention to what is out there in the popular press, I was really struck by how much of it didn't match what I know from the research. And it turns out that most of the information that's out there is ignoring a fundamental biological fact.
which is the role of our kids' genes in influencing their behavior. And so it turns out that the single biggest thing that shapes kids' behavior, it's not what we're doing as parents and grandparents, it's the kids themselves. And so by that I mean all kids, extroversion. In fact, about half of the differences you see between kids and why some of them will sit compliantly in church and others are bouncing all over the pew, or some of them are much more prone to throwing huge temper tantrums or being highly impulsive or highly emotional than others. About half of the differences between kids in virtually all behavioral outcomes is due to differences in the DNA sequences that they were born to. And the other half is due to everything else. So it's due to us as parents, us as grandparents, but also neighborhoods, our neighborhoods, their friends, their schools, their cultures. Us as parents and grandparents, we're an important piece of their lives, but we're just one tiny bit of that other 50% that's influencing their behavior. And this is the point where people are usually looking at me saying, well, this is not helpful. What am I supposed to do with this information? And that's why I think as a society, we've largely just ignored it. And we're just going to talk about what we think we can do as parents and grandparents. And I think that's a huge mistake for two big reasons. The first is what I call the parenting myth. Because by doubling down on all the things we feel like we should be doing in our kids' lives, it creates this idea that we are going to be able to super parent them right into that Ivy League school or that Nobel Prize. And nothing that we know about child development suggests that that is the case. And the problem is that what that does, what that tremendous focus on parenting does, is it places a lot of pressure on parents who feel like if I am not doing all the things, clearly I want the best for my children, my grandchildren. So I should be doing all of the things. And God forbid they're struggling, I must be doing something wrong. I need to read more books or how can I be a better parent, grandparent? It really causes a lot of pressure on parents, but it also causes pressure on kids who feel this tremendous weight of our expectations for who we want them to be. And rates of anxiety are higher in kids now than we have ever seen before. And we think that part of that reason is due to this hyper focus on children now. And the last part is that this myth that if we just do enough, we can make our kids fabulous. It creates, if we're honest, a culture of judgment, meaning that we've probably all, I know I'm guilty of this, looked at the child who's throwing a fit in Target or the teenager who's talking back to the parent, and we've looked at the child and we've looked at that parent and we have judged. And we have thought that parent really needs to fill in what your favorite piece of parenting advice is right there. And the reality is that parent with the child who is on the floor screaming in Target has probably read more parenting books and blogs than the rest of us combined. They need our support more than our judgment. The other reason that I think it's a big mistake not to be talking about how much of kids' behavior is really wired from within is that it causes us to miss an opportunity to develop a deeper relationship with our kids and to better support them in navigating some of these things that might be their challenges and in really helping them reach their potential. And so this is where the idea of personalized parenting comes in. So how many of you, by show of hands, have heard of the precision medicine or personalized medicine? So only a few folks here, my parents, because they hear me talk about it all the time. I find that actually in crowds, not a ton of people have, but in science, it is all we talk about. So the National Institutes of Health is pouring billions of dollars into personalized medicine. It was announced in President Obama's State of the Union speech in 2015, and then it was signed into law with bipartisan support. When does that ever happen? The following year? And the whole idea is, right now, when do most of us go to the doctor?
When you're sick.
When something is wrong. And often we don't rush right off to the doctor when we notice something is wrong. We wait and see if it'll get better on its own, and then when it gets worse, then maybe we think about going in. Werderman family, I'm looking at you. So by the time we get in, now things are worse, and then doctors essentially go, okay, well in general we try this to treat this, and then there's this whole trial and error process to figure out what's going to work best for you. And the whole idea of precision medicine is that there's a tremendous amount of information in our genes about what we're more or less at risk for, what's going to work better or worse for us, and we can harness that information. And there are a lot of obvious parallels to kids as well, too, because kids' behavior is just as strongly genetically influenced as is their predisposition to allergies or asthma. And similarly, very often right now, what we do is when our kids start having challenges, we hope it'll get better on its own, and then when it gets worse, that's when all of a sudden we're reading parenting books or taking them to psychologists and trying to figure out what's going on. But by understanding how kids are wired, what we can do is essentially move from being in reactive mode to being proactive. By understanding how kids are wired, we can know what they're most likely to be more at risk for, what are going to be some of the challenges, and what are ways that we can then support our kids in essentially reaching their potential. Because all of our kids are wired differently, which means that they are all going to respond to different things. In the same way that we could all take a drug and our bodies might respond differently to it, there actually is no one right way to parent. Most of what exists in parenting magazines and blogs is overall good parenting tips for the average kid. But none of us have average grandkids or kids, right? Our kids are all different. And in fact, different kids respond to different types of parenting techniques. And so, in fact, the best parenting is flexible parenting, where you are parenting to or grandparenting to each of those individual children. So that's what I'm going to talk a bit about today. So to get started, I have to do a quick flashback to basic biology. Promise it won't be too heavy. But we want to understand where our kids' dispositions come from. And so we all have, in every single cell in our body, 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 3 billion base pairs. That's the A, C, T, G that you remember taking in high school biology. 3 billion base pairs. And they code for all the things that make us human and make us individuals. So the vast majority of our DNA code, 99.9%, is shared. It's things that code for 10 fingers, 10 toes, arms, legs, internal organs. But the 1%, the 0.1% that differs is still 3 million locations in our genome and all of the combinations thereof. And that contributes to differences in why some of us have brown hair or blonde hair or blue eyes or brown eyes, or why some of us are more at risk for cardiovascular diseases or cancers. But it also codes for differences in the ways that our brains are wired. And so in the same way that we can look around and see genetic differences that result in how all of us look on the outside, the thing that I think is most interesting is that there are equally fascinating and complex genetic differences in how we're wired on the inside. So we all have brains, and it's a natural human assumption to think other people's brains work the way ours do. But in fact, they're all wired so differently that it contributes to why all of us have our own unique personalities and characteristics. And that's of course true of our kids and grandkids too. So every child is a mix of half of the DNA from biological dad and half of the DNA from biological mom. And it's totally random which 50% you get from dad and from mom. So we're going to do a quick little basic biology problem here. Let's take something like height. Height, like behavioral outcomes, there's no single gene for height. It's not like people come in tall and short flavors. We come, it's continuously distributed, just like actually anxiety or depression or impulsivity. All those things are continually distributed. There's thousands of genetic variants that impact them. Some of them increase and some of them decrease. So where you kind of fall is an average of all the, in this case for height, let's call them the T, the tall genes, ones that make you taller, and S, the short versions, or ones that make you shorter. So if you have two average height parents, then they're going to have about half of those genetic variants that are making them taller, and about half that are making them shorter, and they equal out, and they're average height. So let's just say there's 10 genes influencing that. If you have two average height parents, what is the most likely height of their child? Average, exactly. Because which one of these they get, you're going to get 5 from mom, 5 from dad. It's like a coin toss, right? So on average, you're going to get about half of the tall, half the short, average child. Now that's usually, but not always. So it's not likely that you're going to do a coin toss and get 10 tails in a row, but it's possible. Or 10 heads in a row, but it's possible. And this is why we can look at kids or grandkids and go, some of that you're like, oh yeah, I know where that's coming from. That was my child, or that's his dad, or that's mom. And some of these characteristics you look at and you're like, wow, where did this come from? This one I wasn't expecting. And this is how it can happen. It turns out that actually there's a bunch of scientists like me who are now working on scanning the entire genome to identify all these specific variants. And what we essentially do is we add them up and weight them by how big of an effect they have to create an overall genetic score for things now like impulsivity or anxiety. It's only used in research purposes, but in all your grandkids' lifetime and my kids' lifetimes, this is 100% coming. In fact, my research center is going to launch genetic risk scores for addiction within the next few months. So it's coming faster than anyone is imagining. But it turns out you don't actually need to have any of your grandkids genotyped to know a little bit about what their natural predispositions are. And this is because the way that it works is that we're all born with a genetic code, and that influences the way our brains are wired. And that then impacts kids' dispositions toward things like fear, frustration, anxiety, sociability. And these characteristics then impact the way they interact with the world. And so we talk about 3 big ways that actually our genes influence our environments. And so the first is that based on the genes that we inherit, which impact our dispositions, it influences the responses that kids evoke from the environment. And so if you have a really happy, agreeable baby, everybody wants to hold it, and they look at it, and they smile at it. And if you have a baby that cries all the time, nobody wants to hold your crying baby. Even parents don't want to hold crying babies after a while. But of course, what that means is that those babies are getting very different experiences from the beginning with the adults that surround them. And now you imagine you take them as young children, and the child that's impulsive and bouncing all over the place, they might have teachers that are constantly going, sit down, I told you to sit down, back in your chair. And the child who happens to be lower on that and is sitting there compliantly, they might be daydreaming about all kinds of things, but they're not getting that same kind of feedback. So that impulsive child might then also start to think like, oh, but is there something wrong with me? Oh, teachers are mean. So dispositions influence the responses we get from the environment. They also influence the way that people respond to an environment. So my husband and I can walk outside in the morning and he goes, oh, it feels amazing. And I'm like, oh, it's so cold. That's the exact same environment. And we've had a very different experience of it just based on our composition of who we are. Or you could imagine that, you might be at a cocktail party or chatting with someone over refreshments after this, and you and your friend meet someone over the ham biscuits, and then you walk away and you go, oh my gosh, isn't that person great? They were so fun. And the friend is like, oh, I thought they were so annoying. Exact same interaction, and yet you experienced it very differently based on your own dispositions. The last way that our genes actually influence our environments is that they can impact the environments that we end up in. So when kids are little, the biggest way they can influence this is through their behavior. And by that I mean, if you take your grandkids to the library and they are running all around, pulling the books off of their shelves, and the library is giving you dirty looks the whole time, you are less likely to think of the library as a fun bonding place with your grandkids. They're less likely to end up spending time in the library. On the other hand, as kids get older, now once they're adolescents, once they're teenagers, they actually have more freedom to select into particular environments. And so what you might have are the teenagers who want to spend time with a friend, at the movies or at someone else's house. And then you have the teenagers that are like, I can't wait to be at that party with everybody. And of course, those different environments then feed back to further influence brain development. So all of these ways that started with our genetic codes are actually then further influencing our brain development via these interactions with the environment. And it's this loop right here. This is where us as parents and grandparents can have the biggest effect, because we can help kids with how to interpret and respond to and process what is going to end up happening in terms of these interactions between dispositions and the environments that they live in. So let's unpack what that means a little bit more. So this is my little bundle of genes. And of course, he is a product of 50% of my genes and 50% of his dad's genes. But of course, what that means is that it's not just our kids and grandkids who have genetic dispositions. All of us have our own genetically influenced dispositions as well. So every interaction that you're having with your children or your grandchildren is a product of their genes and your genes. And sometimes that fit can be easier or not as easy depending on their disposition and your disposition. And so, as an easy example, if you have a highly extroverted child here, and they have a highly extroverted dad, then dad is taking them to festivals and to carnivals and to sporting events. Everybody's having a grand time. Parenting feels easy. On the other hand, the exact same child with a different dad, now let's imagine dad's more introverted, more introspective. Dad's taking the child to the library reading hour. They're running around, pulling off all the books, or they're taking them to computer coding class. And the child is going, oh my God, this is so boring. When are we going to be done? Why are you making me do this? Exact same child, but a very different set of interactions with the parent based on differences in disposition. Now, if you imagine that same father with the child who is maybe also more introverted and more introspective, they're all hanging out downstairs in the Kilmarnock Library, reading together, having a lovely Sunday afternoon. But very often, because we imagine that other people's brains work the way ours do, the activities that we plan with our grandkids, with our kids, with our friends, are what we imagine will be fun. And sometimes that's not a great fit for what our kids. This doesn't mean that our kids get to drive the bus all the time and decide what's going on. But when you can think a little bit beforehand about, is the library reading hour going to be a good fit for the 5-year-old who can't sit still for the 20 minutes in church? It's good to at least go in with an open mind that maybe we should sit toward the back so we can make a quick exit. So by thinking a little bit beforehand about your kid's disposition and whether particular things are going to be a good fit, it can help you plan a little bit in advance, or at least level set on expectations so you're not as royally disappointed. Or as Susan and I like to say, the moments where you realize Norman Rockwell is dead. Now, of course, the other piece of this is that very often it's not just one adult in a child's life. Very often there is a co-parent or a co-grandparent. And now you can imagine here in this case where you have the more introverted son, the more introverted dad, and they're hanging out and they're reading books together. And now if you have more extroverted mom is saying, I'm so worried about them. They always hang out in their room by themselves. And that's when, fine, they're reading, they enjoy it. And, no, they're not going to have enough friends. They're never going to learn social skills. I'm really worried about them. In fact, mismatches in dispositions and what we imagine that kids want and need is very often a hidden source of conflict within families. Because we are imagining that the things that our kids need based on what our needs were. And sometimes that fits, and sometimes it's not as close of a fit. So, the idea here is that when you recognize and you're intentional about kids' dispositions, what it can really do is help reduce some of this family friction by understanding where some of these sources of tension are coming from, maybe from the part of the child, from the part of your spouse. Another thing that it can allow us to do is help the kids in our lives appreciate their strengths and feel comfortable in their own skin. And so I gave the example of the impulsive little child who's bouncing in and out of their seat, who's getting all the negative feedback from teachers. We can either look at those children and say, wow, what a fiery spirit they have, so much energy, and think about how do we help them with their lagging skills. There are going to be sometimes they need to learn how to sit in their seat, but also how do we help them see that as a strength and not as something that's wrong with them? And this is one of the things that I find very often when I'm talking to parents and kids. And I think it's one of the greatest gifts that grandparents can also give their children, their grandkids, which is to help appreciate all those wonderful qualities in them, because you also get to hand them back too. So you are in a better place to be able to appreciate some of those things and help kids see those qualities as their own secret strengths as well. Because the reality is otherwise, if we are not proactive about thinking about our kids, where are the areas where they might need a little extra support, and how do we provide those supports rather than making them feel like something is wrong, then we're always going to be in reactive mode. We're always going to be coming behind frustrated or whatnot with those kids. And so I sometimes give the analogy that if your child was struggling with algebra, you wouldn't say, go to your room, and then when you come out in 15 minutes, we're going to try again, and I expect you to be able to do those algebra problems. They can't do algebra because they're lacking the skills. And with behavior, that's very often what we do. We say, okay, go to your room, come back, we're going to try again. But many times, kids, when they're misbehaving, they want our praise, right? They want to be loved and all of those things. Very often when they're misbehaving, it's not because they don't have the motivation to behave properly, it's because they actually don't have the skills. And so how do we help them gain some of those skills? Because we know that the highly impulsive, risk-taking child, the one who's dangling from trees, more likely to end up in the ER, giving parents or grandparents a heart attack, this child, fast forward a decade, is more likely to be this child, but not necessarily. There's no reason that same risk-taking disposition can't be channeled into this or into this. And in fact, several folks in the audience will know this little risk taker is my little risk taker who comes by it honestly, because his dad, my brother are all in fact fighter pilots. One way to channel a novelty-seeking disposition. Because DNA is not destiny. We are all born with different dispositions. Our brains are wired in different ways, but that doesn't mean that, of course, with life and experience, that won't further shape us and channel how these things turn out. And so, the takeaways, if you remember anything from this Sunday afternoon, is that I think we can all relax a little bit, that molding our children into, or grandchildren, dreamy human beings is not all on our shoulders. They are not little lumps of clay that it's up to us to make sure they turn out growing into human beings. Their DNA is taking care of a lot of this. And as I mentioned, I think that actually this is one of the wonderful places that having grandparents in your life, in kids' lives, can make such a difference, because you have done this before. You have seen that all the things that you do, your children grow up, for better or worse, all the things that we attempt to do, they grow up into adults, hopefully moderately well-functioning adults. And so now that you have grandkids, you can appreciate all the lovely little things about them, help those kids see their strengths, help accentuate those strengths, and help them overcome their challenges without becoming mired in the day-to-day, which so often as parents now, I feel like we become very consumed with the day-to-day. We can all relax a little bit. The analogy that I give is to remind parents, if you think back to when you were pregnant or when your partner was pregnant, primarily what you were doing was marveling at that baby's growth and development. Yes, you want to do all the things you can to nurture it, so you're trying to eat right, you're probably trying to be healthy and exercise and take your vitamins, and if you're a partner, you're trying to provide a kind of stress-free environment. so that you can nurture that baby's growth. And yes, we know that there are some more extreme environmental things, heavy drug use, et cetera, which can really derail growth. But in general, you're trying to provide a good enough environment for that baby to grow and develop. And you're not thinking, if I don't get my diet perfect, my baby is not going to grow arms. Or conversely, wow, if I take enough prenatal yoga classes, I'm going to grow an extra toe for my child. Really, we're just giving a good enough environment for that child to develop. And the idea of a good enough environment is something that in this day and age has become to be like, oh, but who wouldn't want to go above and beyond and provide their child with the very best? But in fact, very often what we default to in terms of like super parenting or that hyper intensive focus actually isn't helpful for them. It has the same effect as taking yoga classes every single day, thinking you're going to grow your baby some extra toes. So, by understanding your kid's disposition, the thing that it can help with is being proactive in reducing some family stress, helping kids recognize all their unique attributes as strengths, and helping them think about how can we channel these strengths into outlets that everyone's going to be happy with? How can we recognize some of the potential challenges that are going to come with that? And how do we slowly teach them lagging skills? And so, for example, for children that are more anxious or fearful, one of the examples I gave in my book is that on Saturdays when my son was little, we'd be sitting there on Saturday morning at the breakfast table and I would say, oh, guess what? Today we're going to go to the park and we're going to meet up with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and it's going to be so much fun, and this person's going to be here and that person's going to be here. And next thing I know, he would pull off his shoes, throw them across the room and say, I'm not going. And, of course, then, despite all of my training, you say, that is not okay. Go get those shoes, put them on, we are going. I said we're going. That goes nowhere good. It does not lead to a delightful day in the park together. What I finally realized when I thought about it was, oh, my child is more introverted, he's more anxious. And so what seemed to me like a really fun day together was very anxiety-provoking for him. And he didn't have, his little brain was not developed enough to say, Mom, the idea of being at a place I haven't been to before with all these people I don't know is very anxiety-provoking. Instead, the shoe was collateral damage. Once you kind of figure some of these things out with your kids and grandkids, then I realized, oh, I was essentially doing the equivalent of taking a child who couldn't swim and throwing him into the deep end. So instead, we started with, oh, okay, let's have a friend come over to our house. Comfortable, familiar, they get a little more experience with it. Oh, now let's go meet up with them at the park. Oh, look, now we've got another friend coming to the park. And now, though it is still not his favorite thing to do, he will put up with family gatherings and, make a little bit of small, polite chit chat. So it's the whole, by recognizing who your kids are, you can also help teach them some of those skills as opposed to doing the equivalent of throwing them in the deep end. And this is a lot of, for those of you who are interested, what I talk about in my book. I cover 3 big genetically influenced temperamental dimensions. These are things that have shown up in studies of thousands of kids done all around the world. I call them the big 3 E's. It's extroversion, emotionality. So extroversion, we talk a lot about extroversion, introversion in adults, but we don't talk about it as much in kids. And maybe we just don't think about it as intentionally when they're little, but in fact, those preferences show up very early on and can influence how they behave in certain situations, like we were talking about. Emotionality, some kids are just naturally more quick toward strong feelings, towards frustration, towards anger. this is one of the dimensions that can be most challenging for grandparents and parents to navigate. These are the kids who have responses that feel like they get, disproportionately upset, quote unquote, over nothing. The last one is effortful control, or what we'll sometimes colloquially call impulsivity or self-control. And in fact, all kids, as their brains develop, get better on this, but kids will also differ in how good they are at those skills at any given age and where they land in terms of their overall impulsivity as well. And it turns out, so all of these personality styles, there's actually things that you can do as grandparents and parents to create less friction and frustration and help kids who have these different dispositional styles. So in the book, there's little quizzes that you can take to sort of figure out your grandkids and figure out your own dispositions as well, and look at places where you match or mismatch. And then I walk through, what are some of the parenting strategies or grandparenting strategies? What are some of the things we know about what kids with different dispositional styles respond to, for better or worse? And in addition, there's chapters about navigating differences with co-parents. You can ask my husband how well that one works. Working with teachers, coaches, grandparents, other people in the child's life, as well as things like differentiating, I hate this word, but parents ask me about it all the time, normal behavior from, is this actually something that might be a clinical disorder? So with that, I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Do you have any questions?
What do you share with your mom? I'd like to address that question. I can't believe I should raise it.
Bullying for you.
She got 90% of her DNA from this lady right here.
I actually remember my mother saying to me at some point when I was a teenager, we share certain attributes towards strong dispositions, towards strong big feelings. And I was doing something as a teenager that was eliciting some strong big feelings in both of us. And I remember she looked at me and she said, "Oh, all the things that drive me crazy about myself, I see in you too." So that would be a case where sometimes there is a match in dispositions that is not helpful. And I will tell you, my child also, my son also shared that disposition toward big feelings. And I remember we were coloring once with the babysitter before I'd left, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he crumpled up his paper and he threw it down and he stormed out of the room. And she was like, "What just happened?" And I said, "Oh, I know what happened. I'm sure that the blue in the sky that he was coloring was not quite the right color blue, wasn't turning out exactly how he imagined, and so the whole thing was ruined." And so some of you all might have had children or have grandchildren that share some of those attributes. The really good thing is that as brains develop, the part of the brain that helps you manage those strong feelings, the prefrontal cortex, that doesn't really start developing until adolescence through to about age 25. So it'll take a little while, but it gets better even just naturally with brain development.
Yeah.
So dealing with a two-child family and having quite different dispositions between the two, how do you help them get along with each other?
Yes, it's a great question. In fact, in my field, the running joke is every parent is an environmentalist until they have their second child, and then you realize, wait, I'm doing all the same things. Why is this one turning out so different? And of course, when you have kids with different dispositions, whether biologically related or not. And of course, all the things that we were talking about, it doesn't matter if you share genes with that child or not. They have genes, you have genes, and you each got dispositions. And true of siblings. And one of the things that, I talk to parents about is siblings can be, joys and challenges. I have 2 siblings, in all kinds of ways. But one of the things that it can be a great example of, and that especially parents can kind of use this, or grandparents, to help instill this in their kids, is to recognize that everybody is different. We're all wired differently, and so when you have siblings that are very different, it can actually help kids learn empathy, because they might be frustrated about, like, oh, why do they, always do this? Why does they get so upset, or they do this or whatnot? And you say, because all of us are different. And there's going to be some things that are going to be more challenging for them. There's some things that are more challenging for you. And we all experience the world differently. All of our brains are wired differently. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it amazing that all people are a little bit different? And so when you have a sibling, you can kind of use that to help teach empathy. And the other piece I get is that, but what about when sibs say, that's not fair, which I'm sure none of your children or grandchildren ever do, right? Because the idea is we should flexibly tailor the way that we interact with our grandkids and our kids to each child. Won't that inevitably lead to differences? And then the kids will say, that's not fair. How come they got this, or they're being treated this, or the rules are different for them? The thing I say is you can always use that, again, as a teaching example and say, oh, okay, so if they're struggling with algebra, do you have to go to a tutor for algebra too? So do you want to do the algebra tutor as well on Tuesday afternoons? No, you in fact want to be treated differently, because you want to get to do the things, you want us to celebrate the things that are your strengths, and each of you are going to have challenges, and that means that we're going to work differently. You're each going to get to do different activities, we're going to support each of you differently, and so actually when you sort of start to talk to kids about it that way, they get, oh, actually I don't want to be treated exactly the same as my sibling. Just because they want to do baseball doesn't mean I want to do baseball. I want to do wrestling instead. So that tends to be, the examples that I'll use with kids, and they get that pretty quickly.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about staying with the idea of 2 children. And you had said before a very interesting thing about there are as many differences on the inside as on the outside. So both of my kids look somewhat like me, but one of them looks more like me than the other. Should I infer, and have you discovered from research, that I should infer that the greater similarity on the outside might correlate with greater similarity on the inside?
That's an interesting question. I don't actually know of any studies that have directly looked at that. But the only reason that would be the case, by the way, I loved the piano concert. The only reason that would be the case is if genes that influence certain characteristics were close to the genes that are influencing physical characteristics. And so this might be way more than those of you who don't really care about genetics that much want to know, but the 50% that you get from mom and from dad, genes that are really close to each other on a chromosome are more likely to stay together. So if you imagine if you have a long piece of string, it's more likely if you have 2 pieces of string that you'll cross them if they're long, and they might get broken apart separately, as opposed to if you have a teeny short piece of string, the idea that it's going to get broken in the middle is unlikely. So some genes that are right next to each other do tend to kind of travel together. But there's no reason to think that, genes that influence anxiety, are going to be correlated with genes that influence hair color or appearance, because our appearances and most behaviors and even, sort of other internal organ function, liability to diseases are so complex that it isn't the case that just because you look more similar, that it means all of your genetic variation is going to be more similar. It would only be in these funny cases where if there happen to be a couple traits that are located nearby on a chromosome that they would travel together, but not complex things. So overall, probably not.
Danielle?
Yeah.
So if you have twins, I know you've done a lot of research in twins, and I know we've got some twins here. I know Tom's a twin. Yeah, without, going into a big discussion. They're completely different on the inside, but they're the same on the outside, is that?
So the way that twins work, and so yes, twin studies were actually pivotal in the figure I presented early on, that about 50% of the differences in, and actually it's the case for virtually every behavior that's been studied, that about, half of the differences between people is due to differences in their DNA, and the other half is all these differences in their environments. That all comes from twin studies. Because if you think back, 50 years or so, and some of you all might remember that so many, in particular my area, psychiatric and substance use outcomes were very often considered the fault of the parents, usually mothers. We get blamed for everything. And so, autism, schizophrenia, substance use problems, it was all thought that it was, bad mothering that caused these problems in kids. And the way that we systematically studied and figured out, actually they're strongly genetically influenced, was through some natural study designs, twins being one of them. So twins essentially come in two types. So monozygotic twins, or what we call MZ twins, are essentially a single egg fertilized by a single sperm, and at some point in cell division, it breaks into and develops into two individuals. But many of you will remember when they cloned Dolly the sheep, there was all this, media hype about like, oh, are humans next? Clones are going to be, all over the place. And, I always say, well, clones are already walking around all over the place. They're identical twins. They share their genetic material. But, of course, as anyone who knows, or we have an identical twin here, they are far more similar, both physically and very often in personality styles, than two random people you'd pick off the street. But they still develop into their own independent people. And so there's identical twins, and then there's fraternal twins, or what we call dizygotic twins. And that's two eggs fertilized by two sperm, so just like ordinary siblings, except that it's happening at the same time. And so fraternal twins are the type that are genetically influenced and, quote, run in families, because what happens is fraternal twins result from two eggs being ovulated, and hormone levels are genetically influenced. And so that's why you will see fraternal twinning running in families, because genetic influences on hormone levels mean the women in those families are more likely to ovulate multiple eggs. The other thing that causes an increase in fraternal twins is more advanced maternal age. So things are not working quite as smoothly, and you're more likely to ovulate multiple eggs, which is why sometimes you'll see fraternal twins that are kind of like at the tail end of, parents will think, I'll go for one more and the end of the pair. So the reason we're really interested in this from a genetic standpoint is that what you have are two age-matched, fraternal siblings can either be same sex or opposite sex. But if you just take same sex for a minute, you have age and sex matched twin pairs, so a pair of siblings who are being raised in the same family by the same parents, but identical twins share more genetic variation than fraternal twins. And so if it's all about the parents and parental rearing, the shared environment, you would expect that those types of twins should be just as equally similar, because they're all growing up in homes together, being raised by the same parents. But if genes are important, MZ twins or identical twins should be more alike on whatever outcome you're studying than fraternal twins. And if fraternal twins aren't just half as alike as MZ twins, then, because that's all we would expect genetically, if they're a little more than that, then that indicates that there must be some shared environmental, something about being raised in the same family or same schools or whatnot too. And if identical twins are not exactly identical, that also tells you it can't all be genes. It must be unique environmental influences, different friend groups, or one of them's in a car accident or has an intra-utero environment that's different. So this is how we were able to, by doing these huge studies, so I happen to work on big twin studies in Finland, where we collected tens of thousands of pairs of every twin born in the country, and then we follow them across decades, and we study all these different health outcomes for virtually everything that's been studied. Identical twins, far more similar than fraternal twins, which really tells us genes play a role in all of these outcomes and behaviors. In fact, even things like political beliefs and social beliefs have been studied, and they find that identical twins are far more alike than fraternal twins, particularly after they leave the house. Because, you know, we can have a lot of influence on sort of the views when kids are little, but as they start to get older and they're making up their own minds, even things like religiosity, usually not what religion you belong to, but how much you go to church, how much you feel like you're a spiritual person, all those things have been found to be genetically influenced too. And all of this really originally came from twin studies. Yes?
When I was raising my kids, the birth order was kind of the buzz. So if you could just speak a little bit about birth order and what you're talking about.
It's still the buzz, and I will tell you this, and no one is going to believe it, and it's not going to change your minds or the fact that it's still always in the media. The systematic studies that have been done find very little evidence for birth order effects. That it's mostly just, we all have stories in our mind about like, oh, the first one, so they're the, you know, more leading the charge, and the middle child's the good one, you know, and, but in fact, when you actually, that's my family, but when they systematically study it, they have found, I mean, maybe teeny effect sizes, but there's really not any large effects there, despite what you will continue to read in the media.
So in your book, it seems like this emphasizes that each child has a unique nature. They're born with at least half of it. How do you determine that? And is that something that's prescriptive in your book, that there's a process you go through to say these are the unique nature of my kid and I'm not going to change those?
So I wouldn't think of it as, this is my child and I can't change it. I would think of it as, what is the way that my child's brain or grandchild's brain works? What is their kind of natural wiring or disposition? And, you know, I'll tell parents and grandparents are no different, that often you all are in the best position, because especially the more time you spend with kids, you get a sense of what they're like. And, you know, in the book, what I do is I have short surveys that are the kind of surveys that we do in research to assess children's behavior. And so, but they aren't rocket science, meaning, you know, like you could probably ask any parent here, where does your child fall on extroversion, right? Or how naturally fearful they are, or how prone they are to strong emotions. And when you've spent time with a child, you get a sense of that. Usually, we're just not thinking about it in a systematic way, because it just feels like, oh, what's going on with this child? And for me, that's where I find research, surveys, things to be helpful, because it's a sort of ordered way of going, okay, here are the big genetically influenced dimensions. Let me systematically think about where this child falls on them. Okay, what are the things now that kids with different dispositions, what are some of their challenge points? What are some of their strengths? What are the things that they might need differently from the adults in their lives? I find that, you know, often just the day-to-day of kids can be super overwhelming. And so, you know, God love you, Lucia, for taking them for a week, you know, but when you are in it, especially if you have a child with a more challenging temperament, it can just constantly feel like you're trying to manage and come behind and figure out what's going on. And so that's really where I think that, you know, the book can be helpful, and I find the research to be helpful. I jokingly say that, you know, when I found myself raising the, you know, challenging child that I study, highly impulsive, highly emotional, you know, the research was like my lifeline. Not because I was off running to the office, but because it was like, okay, I can, compartmentalize, I know what's going on here. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. Let me have my checklist and my mantra in front of me to remember that, because of course there are still, when you're trying to teach skills to someone that doesn't naturally possess them, it's gonna be a marathon, not a sprint, right? So it's slow, consistent, and I feel like that's one of the places that the research can be helpful, is just remembering, I'm doing the things I need to be doing for this child, and I just need to keep staying the course, because it will take a little while. And, we all know we have natural strengths, and so some kids can, pick up and start playing a sport, and they're gonna naturally be pretty good at it, and other of us are going to sit there and, watch our children running around on the soccer field picking flowers and things for a really long time before they might slowly discover, oh, there's the soccer ball. Okay, all right, now, so there's a lot of child development that, I think is like that. Some kids it'll come naturally to them, some kids it won't. But for me, sort of knowing what I'm supposed to be looking for and what I can be doing is, I think, a way to, keep it all feeling manageable.
I want to thank you, Danielle, for bringing such incredibly relevant and interesting, whether you're talking about understanding yourself, your own children, your grandchildren, your siblings, all of it is relevant, and you can find so much of that information in your book. It is wonderful. And before the grandkids come, we're going to do the checklist. So, just see how it goes. See how it goes. But I want to thank you so much for joining us and intimately.